Hello and welcome to another episode of Cartoon Breakdown. I'm your What is it now? Yeah, I thought as much. Hello and welcome to another episode of Cartoon Breakdown. I'm your host, the Animator. I have a question for you, which you probably already know the answer given the title of this episode. What do you get when you combine Batman the Animated Series and Tiny Toon Adventures? Of course you get Freakazoid, one of the weirdest and wackiest shows that has ever come out of Warner Brothers Animation Studio that I know of. I remember watching the show and loving every single moment of it. However, my parents were less than enthusiastic about watching it too. About the show. Freakazoid is a show about a teenager who happens to be a super nerd named Dexter Douglas, who gets sucked into cyberspace and comes out with the ability to turn into a superhero named Freakazoid, who happens to have the entirety of the internet downloaded into his brain. Understandably, this makes him a little crazy. With his newfound powers, Freakazoid, with the help of a Scotsman named Roddy McStew, his girlfriend Steph, and of course the most lovable character on the show, Sergeant Mike Cosgrove, he goes around saving the city from various supervillains that threaten it. Oh, did I mention the other superheroes? Yeah, because there's other superheroes in there too. Production. The show came about because Steven Spielberg was looking for a new superhero-type show. He decided to work with the crew of the Batman the Animated Series. There were two pitches that were being thrown around. The first was going to be a sci-fi / action adventure show called Judge Run. It was going to be set in a Star Wars-type environment, and the main character was going to be a smuggler / pirate. The other show was going to be about a teenage boy who happens to gain superpowers and become the Freakazoid. Try to guess which won out. Bruce Timm wanted the show to be very straightforward and tell a story similar to Spider-Man with this teenager coming to grips with his superpowers. However, after several meetings with Steven Spielberg, Timm came to the realization that Spielberg wanted a show that was more zany than what he was comfortable doing. So he decided to step down from production to give the show a chance to be more like what Spielberg was looking for. Most of the original crew were still part of the production of Freakazoid that came over from Batman the Animated Series, despite Bruce Timm leaving. Tom Ruegger was brought in to revamp the series. It was Ruegger's influence that created the way that the show would be written, with a sort of blackout-style comedy. Since Bruce Timm had already created the designs of each of the characters, both main characters and villains, it was up to the writers to come up with the backstories, especially since the show itself didn't have a series bible, or set of rules for the show to follow. Despite most of the first season having been written, there wasn't an origin story for Freakazoid. Ruegger brought in both Paul Rugg and John P. McCann to start writing for the show. They were tasked with writing the origin story for Freakazoid, and spent a great deal of time trying to figure out the logistics of the show. The origin even had a garage door opener as part of the story. But Ruegger told the two to just get started writing and stop focusing on the underlying logic to a show which had no logic. In the second season, producer Mike Schauer left to produce his own series, The Angry Beavers. There was a mass exodus from the show, mostly from directors who left to either work on Warner Brothers' new Superman series or to exit Warner Brothers altogether. At the same time, Ruegger had 3 other shows that he was working on, which was Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, and Road Rovers. It was at this point that Rugg and McCann didn't want to produce anymore as they thought it would take away from their writing. But Gene McCurdy, who is the executive in charge of production for Warner Brothers Animation, told them that the only way to have a second season for the show would be if they stayed and wrote for it. The show changed its dynamics in the second season, opting to have half-hour episodes rather than the short animated segments they were doing in the first season. They also did away with a lot of the other characters such as Huntsman, Lord Bravery, and Fat Man and Blubber Boy. What's funny is on one of the episodes on season 2, they actually addressed this by having the characters confront Freakazoid as to why they're not on the show anymore. Despite Rugg and McCann staying with the show, it was still cancelled after the second season. In fact, the last episode that was aired on WB wasn't even the last episode of the season. That didn't air until it was being rerun on Cartoon Network. Voice cast and characters. For the cast of characters for the show, you had the main character Freakazoid, voiced by Paul Rugg, who was given the role after he kept complaining about how everyone trying out for it didn't do it correctly. As I've stated before, Freakazoid is a little strange, but after all, he did have the entirety of the internet downloaded into his brain. One can only imagine what kind of freak he'd be if he had the internet downloaded into his brain from today. Freakazoid's greatest weakness is that he can be imprisoned by a cage made out of graphite bars charged with negative ions. He's also expressed a great aversion to poo gas on multiple episodes. For the most part, he's extremely distracted, especially when he's talking to his best friend, Cosgrove. The next character I'd like to talk about is Dexter Douglas, voiced by David Kaufman, who is the alter ego to Freakazoid. Dexter is a 16-year-old computer ace who's extremely geeky, and when he wants to change into the Freakazoid, all he has to say is freak out. For him to change back into Dexter, Freakazoid says freak in. Next you have Roddy McStew, voiced by Craig Ferguson, who is an ill-tempered Scotsman who works for the bad guy Gutierrez. He's the one that found the flaw with the Pinnacle chip that would turn Dexter into the Freakazoid. Then you have Steph, voiced by Tracy Rowe, who is the perky blonde girlfriend for Freakazoid. She likes Freakazoid but doesn't want to have anything to do with Dexter. Then you have the last of the good guys that I'm going to be talking about. This is my favorite character and possibly the best character of the show. Of course I'm talking about Sergeant Mike Cosgrove, voiced by Ed Asner. He's your stereotypical heavy-set gruff cop who happens to have a heart of gold and is often seen in most of the episodes doing things that are less cop-like. More often than not, he's the reason why Freakazoid gets distracted from the task at hand by asking him if he wants to go out and do things with him. However, it's not as bad as it sounds. Cosgrove usually gives Freakazoid information that's relevant to the episode, and when he comes to the realization of what Cosgrove said, Freakazoid runs off and leaves Cosgrove to enjoy whatever they're doing by himself.
We interrupt this program to bring you this information about the narrator of the show, voiced by Joe Lathy, who is very vocal and sometimes gets more involved than the job usually requires. We now return you to your regularly scheduled program.
As for the enemies of the show, Freakazoid would usually fight the Lobe, voiced by David Warner. He's literally a giant brain attached to a body with eyeballs and a mouth. He's got low self-esteem issues, and more often than not, Freakazoid foils his plans by simply insulting him or his plan, so he gives up. The next villain is Armando Gutierrez, voiced by Ricardo Montalban. Gutierrez is the head corporation that created the Pinnacle chip, which has turned Dexter Douglas into Freakazoid. As you can see, he physically resembles Ricardo Montalban, only with a patch over his eye. The reoccurring joke of the series is that he's always asking people to laugh with him. One of the more funnier parts of the series is when somebody calls him a weenie, and to hear Ricardo Montalban say, "No, I am not the weenie, you are the weenie." It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Of course, I want to talk about one of the other characters that has no speaking roles and isn't animated, but is in every episode. Of course, I'm referring to Emmett Nervan. This is a character that has a very unique story behind him. Emmett originated as a sketch from the first producer, Mitch Schauer. Ruger saw it and loved it and asked if he could use it in the show. It's kind of like a deranged version of Where's Waldo, and he's usually hidden somewhere in the background. Broadcast history. Season 1 of the show started September 9th, 1995, and went on until February 17th, 1996, with 13 episodes. Season 2 of the series started September 7th, 1996, and went on to have the last episode air February 14th, 1997, with 2 unaired episodes remaining. The 2 remaining unaired episodes were aired May 31st and June 1st on Cartoon Network. The show had a total of 24 episodes, and the series remained in syndication on Cartoon Network, developing a cult following. As for watching the show today, you can find it on most streaming services like Amazon, YouTube, iTunes, and of course Google Play. You can find the DVDs on Amazon for under $20 each, and it's well worth the money, as I remember... Oh yeah, maybe I should address this. There was a bit of a controversy involved with Mike Allred's Madman. When the show came out, many people who loved the comic book Madman alerted Allred to the similarities between his comic and Freakazoid. He was informed by Bruce Timm that Madman was a direct inspiration for the show, however, he wasn't happy about not being given any acknowledgement or credit. He simply wrote a friendly letter to Steven Spielberg, letting him know that the production was a direct lift from his creation. However, as Madman was an amalgamation of half a dozen other influences, he didn't feel he had the right to complain or sue. I remember how zany the show was, and there were many characters that I didn't mention that you should really get into watching the show to see for yourself. In fact, the show was once described as being as close to improv animation as you can get, as the show started out with Bruce Timm and finished with Tom Ruegger. I don't know if the show could actually be made nowadays, and I for one would really not like to see that happen. It was a strange adventure into how weird a show can get, especially if the people involved are left to their own devices. Anyways, that's gonna do it for this episode. As always, I'm your host, the Animator, and this was Cartoon Breakdown. How come
We interrupt this ending gag to bring you another important message. I can never find matching socks. That is all.
Hey, if you like what you saw and you want to see more, please consider checking out my channel. I have a lot of content there based around cartoons, and if that sounds like something you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe, as I would be very grateful. Another thing that would be very helpful is like this video and comment. I'm the Animator, and thanks for watching.